All right, History 101 students, let's talk about Chapter 5 in Kevin Riley's Worlds of History. We're talking about sex, love, gender in the classical world. And the classical world is defined roughly 500 BC to 500. And the societies we're looking at are classical India, classical China, classical Greece, and classical Rome. Now, the way that the chapter itself is set up is we have a secondary source that addresses all of these societies at one time and gives us kind of a breakdown about what the position of women was during the time period during each of these societies. So you want to be thinking about that. Where do women seem to have the better position, the worse position? What seems to be their freedoms, their constraints in these various societies? And then you want to use the primary sources to see for yourself, to double check it, and to see if those primary sources add anything. And there's one primary source from each of those places. Now, as far as the historical concepts you're supposed to be thinking about, I want you to think about issues of author, audience, and agenda for each of these sources. Now, author is critical. Who actually wrote this? And sometimes we don't know. But you want to know who the person is, not just their name, but what is their background. And this is not a skill only for history. This is a skill for the contemporary world. When you are reading a book or an article that is putting forth some kind of argument about science, some kind of argument about history, some kind of argument about you name it, I don't know how seriously that argument should be taken if the person doesn't have much of a background in it, right? Sometimes we see media pundits that have written books on all kinds of topics. I don't know if their agenda is anything more than selling books, right? So you want to be aware of that kind of thing. That brings me to agenda. We'll come back to audience. Agenda. Why did the person write the source? Right? Why did they write it? And who is it intended for? All right? Who is it intended for? And the answer is almost never me and you. All right? For these historical sources, we're bystanders. They just happen to see it. So who is it for? And if you can focus on those three questions for each of these documents, you might find some interesting stuff. So that first document, the secondary source by Hughes and Hughes, go through it as a secondary source. That's going to be the easiest one to read. Those are a couple of historians laying out what it looks like for women during this particular time period in these four societies. The first primary source we're getting to look at is out of China, and it's this piece by Ban Chao, and that is specifically mentioned in the secondary source. So make the connections between it. You want to know who Ban Chao is, and you want to figure out through the setup of the article, why did she write this? Who is the audience? And you got like a little twist with this thing, right? Because in reality, there's two audiences, okay? At least two audiences. One of the audiences is that this is a writing exercise for her daughters. So the idea is that her daughters will copy this down and will learn how to write. And on the other hand, she also knows that other people are going to be looking at this. So think about that as you get into the document in terms of what she's saying to her daughters and what her position is. And then I'll let you decide how much at face value we should take what she says about the position of women and how much of that is being said because other people are reading this document. All right. And it doesn't make a lot of sense until you read it. You take a look at it and see whether you think the document is straightforward or whether there's a little bit of tongue in cheek happening because she is fully aware that other people, men, are reading this. The conduct of wives, husbands, and women, you're not going to find a lot of information about the author. We don't know a lot of information about the author. But you can get some ideas about who, and I'm thinking who in terms of like social class, the document is intended for, right? It is talking specifically about a harem, okay? So, what kind of man might have a harem? It's not just everybody. And what kind of woman might find herself in a harem? And again, it's not just everybody. So, using that idea is one way to get into the document. And then looking at the rules and the behaviors and, quite frankly, the politics of the harem is an interesting thing because not everybody in the harem is in the same position, right? So take a look at that and then again cross-reference it with the secondary source. The fourth piece is we're going to come back to Plato and his piece on the symposium. And now we're back to another dialogue and we're back to a conversation about what is love. So again, who is the author? And what is the point of this conversation? Because I don't know if the conversation is only about, on the surface, what is love. You know, take a look at it. And there's some different ideas about what love actually is put forth in there. And then you can think into yourself, well, why would this great philosopher get caught up in this idea about what is love? What's his point? So that's something you can do. And again, cross-reference it to the position of women in the Greek world in the secondary source. And then finally, well, not quite finally, but finally, as far as the written sources go, we've got this poem from the Roman poet Ovid. And it's an interesting one. And so who is he? And then don't answer the question who it's written for until you get through the whole thing. Because if you only read book 1 and book 2, it seems like it's very clearly written for men. But then when you get to book 3, there's a new audience, women. And what does that tell you about his agenda? Because maybe his agenda changes. But really, what does it tell you about attitudes towards sex and love and marriage in the Roman world, at least for the members of whatever class that this piece would have been addressed to? And then finally, this is the real finally, there's these images in the book, these depictions of gender in classical societies, really looking at, a piece from, each of these societies. Take a look at each one of those, see what you can do with it. But mostly, I want you to focus on those texts, and I want you to focus on figuring out how you can incorporate this stuff into your formal essays. That's it. See you guys around campus.